The dust rose in lazy spirals around the boots of Preston Anders as he stood outside the Thornton homestead on that burning June morning in 1882. His hat clutched between weathered hands, waiting for an answer that seemed suspended somewhere between hope and heartbreak. He had asked Winona Thornton to marry him 3 weeks prior, and she had looked at him with those storm-gray eyes and said she needed time to think, time to be certain, time to know her own heart before binding it to another's for the rest of her days. Preston was 26 years old, born and raised on a cattle ranch 15 miles south of La Veta, Colorado, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. His father had died when he was 17, leaving him to run the ranch alongside his younger brother and their aging mother. He had learned early that life in this territory meant hard work, harder winters, and the kind of loneliness that settled into a man's bones like morning frost. He had seen Winona for the first time 2 years ago at the summer dance in town, and something in his chest had shifted permanently, like the earth settling after a storm. She was 23 then, newly arrived from Kansas with her widowed father and younger sister, Lily. Her father, Samuel Thornton, had purchased a modest spread of land northeast of town, hoping to start fresh after losing his wife to pneumonia. Winona carried herself with a quiet strength that drew Preston's attention immediately. She wore her dark brown hair pinned up simply, revealing a graceful neck and shoulders that spoke of both delicacy and resilience. When she smiled, which was not often in those early days, her entire face transformed into something luminous. Preston had courted her slowly, respectfully, knowing she was still grieving her mother and adjusting to this new, harsh landscape. He would ride out to the Thornton place on Sunday afternoons, helping Samuel mend fences or repair the barn roof, always finding excuses to linger near where Winona worked in the garden or hung laundry to dry in the relentless Colorado wind. They would talk about small things at first, the weather, the crops, the town gossip. Gradually, the conversations deepened. She told him about her childhood in Kansas, about helping her mother bake bread every Saturday, about the books she loved to read by candlelight. He told her about the ranch, about his dreams of expanding the herd, about the way the mountains looked in winter when they were covered in snow. By the spring of 1882, Preston knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend his life with this woman. He saved his money carefully, rode all the way to Denver to purchase a simple gold band, and on a warm evening in late May with the wildflowers blooming across the meadows, he had asked her to be his wife. She had not said no, but she had not said yes either. "I need to be sure," she had told him, her voice soft but firm. "Marriage is forever, Preston. I need to know that this is what I truly want, not just what seems safe or expected." He had respected her honesty even as it carved a hollow place in his chest. "I'll wait," he had promised. "As long as you need." Now, standing in the June heat with sweat trickling down his spine, Preston wondered if perhaps he had been foolish to hope. 3 weeks had stretched into 4, then 5. June had melted into July, and still Winona had not given him her answer. He came by the Thornton place regularly, still helping with chores, still talking with her in those precious moments when they found themselves alone. But there was a careful distance in her manner now, as though she was holding herself back deliberately, testing something he could not quite understand. Samuel Thornton stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his work pants. He was a solid man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Morning, Preston," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "You looking for Winona?" "Yes, sir," Preston replied, squaring his shoulders. "If she has time to talk." Samuel studied him for a long moment, and Preston thought he saw sympathy in the older man's expression. "She's down by the creek," he said finally. "Been spending a lot of time down there lately, thinking things through. You're a good man, Preston. I hope she can see that." Preston nodded his thanks and walked around the side of the house, following the worn path that led through the cottonwood trees toward the small creek that ran through the Thornton property. The sound of water over stones grew louder as he approached, and then he saw her, sitting on a flat rock near the bank, her skirts tucked around her legs, her face tilted up toward the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. She heard his footsteps and turned, and for a moment, something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or maybe relief. "Preston," she said, standing quickly, brushing at her skirts. "I did not expect you today." "I know," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "But I needed to see you. Winona, it has been almost 2 months since I asked my question. I do not mean to rush you, but I need to know where I stand. If your answer is no, I will accept it and leave you in peace, but this waiting is harder than any work I have ever done." She looked down at her hands, clasping them together. When she raised her eyes to his again, he saw they were bright with unshed tears. "You think I am playing with your heart," she said quietly. "That is not my intention, Preston, I promise you that. Then what is it?" He asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What holds you back? If you do not love me, just tell me plainly." "That is the problem," she said, and a tear spilled down her cheek. "I do love you. I think I have loved you for a long time, but love alone does not guarantee happiness, does it? My mother loved my father desperately, and when she died, I watched him nearly die too from the grief. I saw what it did to him, to lose the person he loved most in this world. And I am terrified, Preston. Terrified of loving you that much, of building a life with you, only to have it all ripped away." Preston felt something in his chest crack open. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "Winona," he said, his voice thick. "I cannot promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. Life in this territory is hard and uncertain, and we both know that. But I can promise you that whatever comes, we will face it together. And is not a life lived in fear of loss a kind of death itself? Would you rather never love at all than risk the pain of losing?" She looked up at him, searching his face. "My father has been encouraging me to say yes," she admitted. "He thinks you are a fine man, and he worries about what will happen to Lily and me if something happens to him. But I do not want to marry you just because it makes practical sense. I want to marry you because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "Then say yes," Preston urged, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands. "Say yes because you love me, because you want to wake up beside me every morning and fall asleep in my arms every night. Say yes because you believe we can build something beautiful together, even in this hard land." She drew in a shaky breath, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes. "I need a little more time," she whispered. "Please, Preston, just a little more time to be certain." He wanted to argue, to press her, to make her understand that certainty was an illusion and life offered no guarantees. But he could see the genuine struggle in her expression, the way she was wrestling with fears that ran deeper than simple doubt. So he nodded slowly, released her hands, and stepped back. "I will wait," he said again. "But Winona, summer will not last forever, and neither will my heart." He turned and walked away before she could see the hurt in his eyes, making his way back through the cottonwoods to where his horse stood patiently waiting. As he rode back toward his ranch, the July sun beating down mercilessly, Preston wondered if he was being a fool. Perhaps he should cut his losses, accept that Winona Thornton was too afraid to take the leap of faith that love required. Perhaps he should turn his attention to one of the other young women in town who had made it clear they would welcome his courtship. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was impossible. His heart had chosen Winona, and no amount of logic or hurt pride could change that fundamental truth. The days stretched on, hot and dusty. Preston threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, helping drive cattle to summer pastures high in the mountains, mending endless miles of fence, breaking a pair of young horses that fought him every step of the way. His younger brother, Thomas, watched him with concern but said nothing, understanding that some kinds of pain needed to be worked through rather than talked through. Preston's mother, Martha Anders, was less circumspect. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she reached over and patted his hand. "You are wearing yourself out over that girl," she observed, her voice gentle but firm. "I am just doing what needs doing," Preston replied, not meeting her eyes. "You are punishing yourself for loving her," Martha corrected. "And that is not fair to either of you. Son, I knew the moment I met your father that I would marry him. We were 17 years old, and within a week of meeting, we were planning our future together. But not everyone is like that. Some people need more time to trust what their heart is telling them." "How much time is enough?" Preston asked, finally looking at her. "It has been 2 months, Ma." 2 months of hoping and waiting and watching her pull away every time I think we are getting close to a resolution. Martha sighed, her weathered face thoughtful. "When your father died," she said slowly, "I thought I would die too. The pain was so immense I could not imagine surviving it. For months, I could barely get out of bed. You and Thomas had to run this place while I fell apart. And I have often thought that if someone had warned me, back when I was 17 and falling in love, exactly how much it would hurt to lose him, would I have still said yes? Would I have still chosen to love him knowing how it would end? And would you have?" Preston asked quietly. "In a heartbeat," Martha said, her eyes shining with tears. "Every single moment of joy, of partnership, of love, it was worth the pain that came after. And I think, deep down, Winona knows that too. She just needs to find the courage to admit it." Preston wanted to believe his mother was right. But as July turned to August with still no answer from Winona, doubt began to creep in like morning fog. He continued to visit the Thornton place, but less frequently now, and always with a sense of resignation rather than hope. Winona seemed to sense the shift in him, and he caught her watching him sometimes with an expression that might have been regret. One afternoon in early August, Preston was in town purchasing supplies when he overheard 2 women gossiping outside the general store. He was not in the habit of eavesdropping, but when he heard Winona's name, his feet stopped moving of their own accord. "She is a fool to keep that Anders boy waiting," one of the women was saying. "He is the best catch in the county, and she acts like he is asking her to throw herself off a cliff." "My daughter told me Winona is afraid," the other woman replied. "After losing her mother so young, she does not want to risk that kind of pain again." "Well, if she waits much longer, Preston will move on," the first woman said tartly. "And then she will spend the rest of her life regretting it. Men like that do not come along often." Preston hurried into the store before they could see him, his face burning. It bothered him that their private situation had become fodder for town gossip, but more than that, the women's words echoed his own fears. How long could he reasonably wait before it became clear that Winona's inability to decide was, in itself, an answer? That evening, as Preston rode back toward the ranch with his supplies loaded in the wagon, he made a decision. He would give Winona until the end of summer, until the first frost, which typically came in late September in this part of Colorado. That gave her 6 more weeks to find her answer. If she still could not commit by then, He would have to accept that she never would and try to move forward with his life. The decision brought him a strange sense of peace mixed with sadness. He did not want to give up on Winona, but he also could not spend the rest of his life in this agonizing limbo. 2 weeks later, in mid-August, Preston was working on the ranch when Thomas came galloping up to the house, his face urgent. "Preston, you need to get to town right now," he said, swinging down from his horse. "There has been an accident." Preston's blood turned to ice. "What kind of accident? Who is hurt?" "Samuel Thornton," Thomas said. "His wagon overturned on the road south of town. Doc Miller has him at his office, but from what I heard, it is serious." Preston did not wait to hear more. He saddled his fastest horse and rode hard for La Veta, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. Samuel had become a friend over the past 2 years, a man he respected and hoped would one day be his father-in-law. But more than that, he knew what this would mean for Winona and Lily if Samuel was badly hurt or worse. When he reached town, he found a crowd gathered outside Doc Miller's office. He pushed through them and found Winona sitting on a bench outside the examination room, her face white as chalk, her hands clenched in her lap. Lily, who was 19 and usually so full of life, sat beside her sister, crying quietly. "Winona," Preston said, dropping to his knees in front of her. "What happened? How is he?" She looked at him, and he saw that she was in shock, her eyes glassy and distant. "We were coming back from the Hendersons' place," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Papa was driving the wagon. A rattlesnake spooked the horses and they bolted. The wagon hit a rut and overturned. Papa was thrown clear, but he landed badly. The doctor says his back is injured and possibly his skull. He has not woken up yet." Preston took her cold hands in his. "He is strong," he said firmly. "Samuel is one of the strongest men I know. He will pull through this." But even as he said the words, he saw the doubt in her eyes, the terrible certainty that the thing she had always feared most was happening again. She was about to lose another parent. Doc Miller emerged an hour later, his expression grave. He was a small, precise man in his 60s, one of the few trained physicians in this part of Colorado. "The next 24 hours will tell the tale," he said quietly to Winona. "His skull does not appear fractured, thank God, but he has a serious concussion. The injury to his back concerns me more. There may be damage to his spine. Even if he survives, he may not walk again." Winona absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Preston felt her hands tighten on his. "Can we see him?" she asked. "Briefly," the doctor allowed. "But he needs rest and quiet." Preston waited outside while Winona and Lily went in to see their father. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Winona's composure had finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face, and she looked utterly lost. "Come on," Preston said gently, guiding her out of the doctor's office. "You need air." They walked slowly through town, Lily following behind them like a ghost. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Preston led them to a quiet spot near the church, where a small garden offered some shade and privacy. "This is what I was afraid of," Winona said suddenly, her voice breaking. "This is exactly what I feared. Everyone I love leaves me or gets hurt. My mother died. Now my father might die or be crippled. And if I let myself love you completely, Preston, if I say yes and build a life with you, something terrible will happen to you too. I know it will. I am cursed." "You are not cursed," Preston said firmly, taking her by the shoulders and making her look at him. "You are human, living in a world where bad things sometimes happen to good people. Your mother's death was not your fault. This accident was not your fault. And loving me will not cause some cosmic disaster. That is fear talking, Winona, not reason." "But what if you are wrong?" she whispered. What if I say yes and then lose you? I do not think I could survive it, Preston. I do not think I am as strong as your mother." He pulled her against his chest, feeling her body shake with sobs. Over her head, he saw Lily watching them with red-rimmed eyes, and he held out an arm to include her in the embrace. The three of them stood there in the fading light, bound together by fear and love and uncertainty. "Listen to me," Preston said, his voice low and steady. "Whatever happens with your father, you are not alone. You and Lily will never be alone as long as I am alive. Whether you marry me or not, I will help you. That is a promise." Samuel Thornton did not die, but neither did he fully recover. After 3 days, he finally regained consciousness. But as Doc Miller had feared, the damage to his spine left him paralyzed from the waist down. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair or confined to bed. The news devastated Winona and Lily, but Samuel himself took it with remarkable grace. "I am alive," he told his daughters when they broke down crying at his bedside. "I can still see, hear, speak, and think. I can still be your father. The rest we will figure out." But figuring it out proved complicated. The Thornton ranch required constant physical labor, which Samuel could no longer provide. Winona and Lily did their best, but there were tasks beyond their strength and experience. Neighbors helped where they could, but everyone had their own ranches and farms to run. Preston found himself at the Thornton place almost every day, arriving early in the morning and staying until after dark. He repaired fences, tended the small herd of cattle Samuel owned, fixed the barn door that had been hanging crooked for months. Thomas joined him when he could, and together they managed to keep the Thornton ranch from falling apart. Through it all, Winona watched Preston with an expression he could not quite read. She thanked him constantly, tried to pay him for his work, which he always refused. He could see the burden of gratitude weighing on her, mixing with her grief and fear to create a complicated knot of emotions. One evening in late August, as the summer heat finally began to break and cooler air drifted down from the mountains, Preston was finishing up the evening chores at the Thornton place when Winona came out to the barn where he was grooming his horse. "You do not have to keep doing this," she said without preamble. "I know you have your own ranch to run." "Thomas and my mother can manage," Preston replied, running the brush along his horse's flank. "They understand." "But why?" Winona asked, her voice edged with frustration. "Why are you being so kind to us when I have given you nothing but uncertainty and pain?" Preston set down the brush and turned to face her. "Because I love you," he said simply. "And because this is what people do when they love someone. They show up, they help, they stand by each other when things are hard. I do not do this expecting anything in return, Winona. I do it because I cannot imagine doing anything else." She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I have been so unfair to you," she whispered, "so selfish and scared and unfair." "You have been honest," Preston corrected gently, "and I have respected that honesty even when it hurt. But I will be honest too, Winona. Summer is almost over. In a few weeks, the first frost will come, and I need to have your answer. Not because I am tired of waiting. I would wait forever if I thought it would make a difference, but because this uncertainty is keeping both of us from truly living. If your answer is no, I will accept it and move forward. But I need to know." She nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. "You are right," she said. "You deserve an answer, and I think, after everything that has happened these past weeks, I am finally ready to give you one." Preston's heart began to pound, hope and fear warring in his chest. "Do you want to tell me now?" "No," she said, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "Give me 3 more days. Come to dinner on Sunday evening and I will give you my answer then. I promise." He wanted to press her, to ask why she needed 3 more days when she had already had months. but he could see something had shifted in her. Some internal battle had been fought and perhaps won. So he nodded, finished saddling his horse, and rode home with his heart in his throat. The next 3 days were the longest of Preston's life. He worked from sunup to sundown, trying to keep his mind occupied, but every spare moment was consumed with wondering what Winona would say. He had given her his ultimatum, set his boundary, and now he had to live with the consequences. Thomas caught him staring off into space more than once. "You are worse than a lovesick calf," his brother observed with a grin. "Shut up," Preston muttered, but without heat. Martha Anders was more sympathetic. On Saturday night, as Preston paced the porch unable to settle, she sat him down and made him drink a cup of chamomile tea. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "you will survive it. You are stronger than you know, Preston, and if she says no, it will hurt terribly for a while, but you will heal. That is what people do. But what if she says yes?" Preston asked, voicing the fear he had barely allowed himself to acknowledge. "What if she says yes and then spends the rest of our marriage afraid and holding back? Is that any way to build a life together?" "That is something the two of you will have to work through," Martha said wisely. "Marriage is not about finding someone perfect. It is about finding someone worth fighting for, worth growing with. If Winona says yes, she will be choosing to fight her fears. That is all any of us can do." Sunday dawned clear and beautiful, with that particular quality of light that comes in late summer when the air begins to cool and the sun seems gentler. Preston bathed, shaved carefully, and dressed in his best clothes: a clean white shirt, dark pants, a vest his mother had sewn for him. He brushed his hat until it shone and polished his boots. If this was to be the most important evening of his life, he wanted to look the part. He rode to the Thornton place in the late afternoon, arriving as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. Lily answered the door, and he was surprised to see she was smiling. "Come in, Preston," she said warmly. "Winona is in the kitchen finishing dinner. Papa is in the sitting room if you would like to say hello." Preston found Samuel in his wheelchair near the window, reading a newspaper. The older man looked thinner than he had before the accident, and there were new lines of pain around his mouth, but his eyes were alert and kind. "Preston," he said, setting aside the paper, "thank you for coming, and thank you for everything you have done for us these past weeks. I do not know how we would have managed without your help." "It was my privilege," Preston said sincerely. "How are you feeling, sir?" "Better each day," Samuel replied. "The body is a remarkable thing. It finds ways to adapt. I will never walk again, but I can move my chair around the house, and with some modifications to the barn, I will be able to oversee the ranch work even if I cannot do the physical labor myself. We are learning to navigate this new reality." There was a pause, and then Samuel looked at Preston with an expression of deep seriousness. "My daughter tells me you are here for an answer to your proposal." "Yes, sir," Preston said, his mouth suddenly dry. "I want you to know that regardless of what she decides, I am grateful that she had a man like you to consider," Samuel said quietly. "You have shown yourself to be honorable, patient, and kind, everything a father could hope for in a son-in-law. But I have also told Winona that she must make this decision based on what her heart truly wants, not on what seems practical or safe. She has lived too much of her life governed by fear. It is time she chose love, if that is what she desires." Before Preston could respond, Winona appeared in the doorway. She had changed into a dress Preston had never seen before, a simple but beautiful gown in a shade of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, pinned up with small flowers woven through the dark strands. She looked nervous and hopeful and absolutely breathtaking. "Dinner is ready," she said softly, her eyes meeting Preston's for a brief, electric moment before glancing away. The meal was a strange affair, formal yet intimate. Lily had set the table with their mother's good china, and someone had picked wildflowers for a centerpiece. The food was excellent roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread still warm from the oven. Conversation flowed around neutral topics: the weather, news from town, the progress of the late summer crops. But beneath it all ran a current of tension and anticipation that made it hard for Preston to taste anything he was eating. Finally, when the dishes had been cleared and Lily had brought out an apple pie for dessert, Samuel cleared his throat. "Lily," he said gently, "why do not we retire to the sitting room and give these two some privacy?" Lily nodded, understanding in her eyes, and helped her father maneuver his wheelchair out of the dining room. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly Preston and Winona were alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Winona stared down at her hands, folded on the table in front of her. Preston waited, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "I have been thinking," Winona finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what you said. About how a life lived in fear of loss is a kind of death itself. And I realized you were right. These past months, while I have been agonizing over whether to say yes or no, I have been so focused on protecting myself from potential pain that I have caused actual pain to you, to myself, even to my father and sister who have had to watch me struggle." She raised her eyes to his, and he saw they were bright with tears but also clear with purpose. "When my father had his accident, my first thought was that it proved me right that terrible things happen to the people I love, that I am somehow cursed. But then I watched you show up day after day, helping us without asking for anything in return. I saw you working in the hot sun, fixing things that broke, staying late into the evening to make sure we were all right, and I realized something." "What?" Preston asked, his voice hoarse. "That love is not just a feeling, it is a series of actions, of choices made every single day to show up for someone, to support them, to stand by them no matter what. You have been showing me what real love looks like all summer, Preston. And I have been too blind and scared to truly see it until now." She stood up, and he stood too, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. She walked around the table until she was standing right in front of him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes, close enough to catch the scent of lavender in her hair. "So yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Preston Anders, I will marry you. I should have said yes months ago, but I was too afraid. I am still afraid if I am being honest, but I am more afraid of living without you than I am of the risk of loving you. You were right, you were worth waiting for, and I can only hope that I was worth the wait too." For a moment, Preston could not move, could not breathe. The words he had been longing to hear for months seemed to hang in the air, almost too precious to trust. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the pent-up longing and relief and joy that had been building inside him all summer. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was their first real kiss. They had been too proper, too careful during the long courtship. Now, with the barrier of uncertainty finally removed, they could let themselves feel everything they had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "You were absolutely worth waiting for," he whispered. "Every single day of doubt and hope and frustration worth it, because you are here now and you are mine and I am yours." "I love you," Winona said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no shadow of fear. I think I have loved you from the very beginning, but I was too stubborn and scared to admit it. Can you forgive me for making you wait so long?" "There is nothing to forgive," Preston assured her, cupping her face in his hands. "You needed time to work through your fears, and I needed to learn patience. We both got what we needed. Now let us focus on what comes next." They returned to the sitting room hand in hand, and the joy on Samuel's and Lily's faces when they saw them told Preston they had been listening at the door. He did not care. He felt like he could float up to the ceiling with happiness. "She said yes," he announced unnecessarily, grinning so widely his face hurt. "Finally," Lily said, laughing and crying at the same time. She rushed over to embrace her sister. "I thought you were going to make him wait until Christmas." Samuel held out his hand to Preston, and when Preston took it, the older man pulled him down into a rough embrace. "Welcome to the family, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of my girl." "With my life," Preston promised. The next weeks passed in a blur of happiness and activity. Preston and Winona decided on a wedding date in mid-October, after the harvest was in, but before the winter snows began. It would be a simple ceremony at the church in La Veta, followed by a reception at the Anders ranch. Winona threw herself into preparations with an energy Preston had never seen in her before, as though making up for all the months she had held herself back. She sewed her own wedding dress with help from Lily and Martha, a beautiful gown of cream-colored silk that she had saved money to buy. She planned the menu for the reception, chose flowers for the church, sent invitations to their friends and neighbors. Preston, meanwhile, worked on preparing the ranch house for his new bride. The house was solid but had been built for practicality rather than comfort. He added shelves in the main room for Winona's beloved books, repaired the cookstove to work more efficiently, built a proper closet in the bedroom they would share. His mother watched his efforts with amusement and affection, clearly delighted that her son had finally found happiness. The wedding day dawned crisp and clear, with the aspen trees on the mountainsides blazing gold and the air carrying the first real bite of autumn. Preston stood at the altar of the small church, Thomas beside him as his best man, trying not to fidget with nervous energy. The church was packed with nearly everyone from town, and the surrounding ranches their community might be small. But when there was a celebration, everyone turned out. Then the church door opened, and Winona appeared on her father's arm. Samuel was in his wheelchair, but he had insisted on being the one to give his daughter away, and together they made their way down the aisle. Winona's face was luminous behind her simple veil, her eyes locked on Preston's with an expression of such love and joy that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The ceremony was traditional and brief. The minister spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and partnership and love. Preston barely heard the words, too focused on the miracle of Winona standing beside him, her hand clasped in his, finally ready to take this leap of faith together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Preston he could kiss his bride, Preston lifted Winona's veil with trembling hands and kissed her gently, tenderly, aware of all the eyes watching them but caring only about this woman and this moment. "I love you, Mrs. Anders," he whispered against her lips. "I love you, Mr. Anders," she whispered back, her smile radiant. The reception at the ranch was everything Preston could have hoped for. Tables groaned under the weight of food that neighbors had contributed. Music filled the air as someone produced a fiddle and another a guitar, and couples began to dance in the yard as the sun sank toward the mountains. Preston danced with his new wife, holding her close as they swayed to the music, both of them grinning foolishly. Later, as the party continued around them, Preston and Winona slipped away to the porch, needing a moment of quiet together. They sat on the steps, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Are you happy?" Preston asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Winona replied. "I was so foolish to wait so long to let fear hold me back. Think of all the time we wasted." "It was not wasted," Preston said firmly. "It brought us here to this moment, and I truly believe that. You needed that time to heal and grow and find your courage, and now we have the rest of our lives ahead of us." "The rest of our lives," Winona repeated as though testing the words. "That sounds wonderful, terrifying but wonderful." "It will be both," Preston agreed. "There will be hard times ahead, I am sure. Winters are brutal here, ranching is unpredictable, and life has a way of throwing challenges at us when we least expect them. But we will face them together. That is what today was about, making a promise to stand by each other no matter what comes." Winona turned her face up to his, and in the starlight he could see tears glistening on her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For waiting. For seeing past my fear to the person I could be if I was brave enough. For showing me what real love looks like." She kissed him, slow and sweet. "I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your patience." "You already are," Preston assured her. "You always were." They stayed on the porch until the party began to wind down, watching their friends and family celebrate around them, both content to simply be together. Later, after the last guests had departed and the ranch house was quiet, Preston carried Winona over the threshold of their bedroom, both of them laughing at the old-fashioned gesture. They consummated their marriage gently, tenderly, learning the contours of each other's bodies, speaking words of love in the darkness. The first year of marriage brought its share of adjustments and challenges. Winona had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, which were different from the small farm she had grown up on. She proved to be a quick learner, though, throwing herself into the work with determination. She learned to help with the cattle, to tend the vegetable garden, to manage the household accounts. Preston, in turn, had to adjust to having a partner in all his decisions, to consulting with someone else before making plans, to sharing his space and his life in ways he never had before. But more than the challenges, there was joy. Joy in waking up beside each other every morning. Joy in working side by side during the day. Joy in the quiet evenings when they would sit by the fire, Preston reading while Winona sewed or planned the next day's meals. Joy in the physical intimacy that deepened their emotional connection. In learning what gave each other pleasure, in the vulnerability of being truly known by another person. They made regular trips to visit Samuel and Lily at the Thornton place, helping with the heavier work that the two women could not manage alone. Samuel had hired a hand to help with the daily chores, a young man from town who was grateful for the work, but Preston still felt a responsibility to check in regularly. He had grown to love Samuel like a father, and he knew how important it was to Winona that her family remained part of her life. In the spring of 1883, Winona discovered she was pregnant. She was nervous about telling Preston at first, worried about his reaction, but when she finally worked up the courage to share the news, his face lit up with such pure delight that she cried with relief. He placed his hand over her still flat stomach with wonder, already imagining the child they would welcome together. "Are you scared?" he asked her that night as they lay in bed, his hand still resting protectively over her middle. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. And I have you beside me, which makes all the difference." "We are going to be good parents," Preston said with quiet confidence. "We both know what it is like to lose people we love, so we will cherish every moment with our child, and no matter what happens, we will face it together." The pregnancy was not easy. Winona suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and as the baby grew, she found the physical demands exhausting. The summer heat of 1883 was particularly brutal, and Preston worried constantly about her working too hard. He tried to make her rest more, to take on her usual chores himself, but Winona was stubborn about remaining useful. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she would tell him, exasperated but touched by his concern. "I just want to take care of you," Preston would reply, and she would soften, knowing his protectiveness came from love. In late November of 1883, as the first real snows of winter began to fall, Winona went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Preston paced the house like a caged animal, driven half mad by the sounds of his wife's pain and his own helplessness. Martha and the midwife from town stayed with Winona throughout, shooing Preston out whenever he tried to enter the bedroom. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the snow-covered mountains, Preston heard a different sound, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. His heart leaped into his throat, and he rushed to the bedroom door just as Martha emerged, her face exhausted but beaming. "You have a son," she said, tears streaming down her face. "A healthy, beautiful boy, and Winona is fine. Tired, but fine." Preston sagged against the wall with relief so intense it made him dizzy. "Can I see them? Give us a few minutes to clean up," Martha said. "Then you can meet your son." When Preston finally entered the bedroom, he found Winona propped up against pillows, pale and exhausted but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Preston approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the small, red face of his son. The baby had dark hair like his mother and was making small snuffling sounds, his tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," Preston breathed, sinking down onto the edge of the bed. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you did this." "We did this," Winona corrected, though her smile turned teasing. "Though I will admit my contribution was slightly more physical." Preston laughed, giddy with relief and joy. What should we name him? They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not made a final decision. Now, looking at their son, Winona said softly, "I was thinking Patrick Samuel Anders, after both his grandfathers." Preston felt his eyes sting with tears. His father's name had been Patrick, and honoring both grandfathers felt exactly right. "Patrick Samuel Anders," he repeated. "It is perfect." He held his son for the first time, marveling at how small and fragile the baby felt in his work-roughened hands. Patrick opened his eyes briefly, revealing dark blue irises that would likely change color in the months ahead, and seemed to look directly at his father before falling back asleep. In that moment, Preston felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. He had thought he understood love when he married Winona, but this was something different, something primal and fierce. He would die for this child without hesitation. He would do anything to keep him safe and happy. "Thank you," he whispered to Winona, carefully handing Patrick back to her. "For him, for everything." "Thank you for being patient with me," she replied, looking up at him with eyes full of love. "For waiting all those months until I was brave enough to say yes. I cannot imagine my life without you, Preston. You and our son, you are everything I never knew I needed." The years that followed were full of the kind of rich, ordinary happiness that Preston had dreamed of during those long summer months of waiting. Patrick grew from a tiny infant into a robust toddler, full of energy and curiosity. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's sturdy build. And by the time he was 3 years old, he was already following Preston around the ranch, insisting on helping with the chores despite being too small to do much more than get in the way. In 1886, Winona gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace Martha Anders. after the quality Winona said had saved their relationship and Preston's mother, who had become like a second mother to her. Grace was different from Patrick, quieter, more observant, with delicate features and her father's dark hair. She adored her big brother, who took his role as protector very seriously. Samuel Thornton remained a constant presence in their lives, despite his limited mobility. He had adapted remarkably to his wheelchair, and with the modifications Preston had made to his house and barn, he was able to participate in ranch management much more than anyone had expected. Lily, now 24, had attracted her own suitor, a schoolteacher who had moved to Lavetta from Denver and Preston, and Winona hosted a wedding for them at the Anders Ranch in the spring of 1887. Life was not without its difficulties. There were years when the cattle market crashed and money was tight. There were harsh winters when they lost livestock to cold or predators. There were illnesses and injuries, the daily grind of hard work, the occasional arguments that came from two strong-willed people building a life together. But through it all, Preston and Winona held fast to each other and to the promises they had made. When times were hard, they leaned on each other for support. When times were good, they celebrated together. They learned to communicate, to compromise, to forgive each other's flaws and failings. They learned that love was not just a feeling but a daily practice, a series of small choices to show up, to care, to try. One evening in late summer of 1889, 7 years after that long wait for her answer, Preston and Winona sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Patrick and Grace were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Martha was inside preparing dinner, and from somewhere in the distance came the lowing of cattle settling in for the night. "You remember that summer?" Winona asked softly, her hand finding Preston's. "When you waited for my answer?" "Every day," Preston replied. "I thought I would go mad from the waiting." "I was such a fool," Winona said, shaking her head. "So afraid of being hurt that I nearly threw away the best thing that ever happened to me." Preston squeezed her hand. "You were not a fool, you were human and you were healing from loss. And in the end, you found the courage to say yes. That is what matters." "I knew you were worth waiting for," Winona said. Echoing the words he had spoken to her that day, she finally accepted his proposal. "Even when I was too scared to admit it, some part of me knew. And I am so grateful that you were patient enough to give me the time I needed." "And I am grateful you eventually said yes," Preston replied with a smile. "Though I will admit, by the end of that summer, I was preparing myself for disappointment." "But you waited anyway," Winona said, turning to look at him. "That is what love is it not? Waiting when it would be easier to walk away, staying when it would be simpler to leave, choosing each other again and again even when it is hard." "Yes," Preston agreed. "That is exactly what love is." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play, feeling the weight of all they had built together. The ranch was thriving. Their family was healthy and happy. They had weathered storms and celebrated victories, and through it all, their love had deepened and matured into something solid and enduring. As the sun dipped below the mountains, and the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, Preston pulled Winona close and kissed the top of her head. "I would wait 1,000 summers for you," he murmured, "and I would do it all again exactly the same way because it led us here." "No more waiting," Winona said firmly, tilting her face up to his. "From now on, we walk forward together whatever comes." "Together," Preston agreed. "Always." The years continued to unfold in a pattern of seasons and growth. Patrick grew into a capable young man who shared his father's love of ranching and his mother's thoughtfulness. By the time he was 15, he was running much of the daily operations alongside Preston, and father and son developed the kind of easy partnership that came from mutual respect and shared goals. Grace, meanwhile, revealed a talent for drawing and painting. She would spend hours sketching the mountains, the cattle, the wildflowers that bloomed in the meadows each spring. Winona encouraged her daughter's artistic pursuits, understanding the need for beauty and creative expression even in the midst of practical ranch life. Preston built Grace a small studio in one corner of the barn where she could work undisturbed, and many evenings would find her there, lost in her art while the rest of the family went about their chores. In 1893, Winona gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel Thomas Anders, honoring both his maternal grandfather and Preston's brother. The baby was welcomed with joy by the whole family, and Patrick and Grace proved to be doting older siblings, always eager to help care for their baby brother. Samuel Thornton, now in his 60s and having spent over a decade in his wheelchair, finally passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1894. His death hit Winona hard, though it was not the devastating blow that her mother's death had been. She had learned over the years with Preston that grief and love were two sides of the same coin, that the pain of loss was the price paid for the joy of connection. She mourned her father deeply, but without the paralyzing fear that had once governed her life. Preston held her through the worst of her grief, just as she had held him when Martha had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia. They had learned to be each other's anchor, to provide comfort without trying to fix what could not be fixed, to simply be present in the darkest moments. Lily and her husband took over the Thornton ranch, and Preston and Thomas helped them through the transition. The two families remained close, spending holidays together, helping each other during busy seasons, maintaining the bonds that had been forged through years of shared joys and sorrows. By the turn of the century, as the world moved into a new era, Preston and Winona found themselves in their 40s, surrounded by the life they had built together. Patrick was now running much of the ranch himself, courting a young woman from a neighboring spread. Grace, at 16, was receiving commissions for her paintings from people as far away as Denver. Young Samuel, now 7, was already showing signs of being as capable and kind as his older siblings. One evening in the summer of 1900, Preston found Winona in the garden, tending the vegetables they had planted in the spring. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck by how beautiful she still was to him. Her dark hair was threaded with silver now, and time had etched lines around her eyes and mouth, but to Preston, she was as lovely as the day he had first asked her to marry him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, setting down her basket and wiping her hands on her apron. "That summer," Preston said, coming to stand beside her, "the one where I waited. It was 18 years ago now. Can you believe that? It feels like yesterday and also like a lifetime ago," Winona said thoughtfully. "I was so different then, so afraid of everything." "And now?" Preston asked. "Now I am still afraid sometimes," Winona admitted. "But I have learned that fear does not have to control me. I have learned that taking risks, being vulnerable, opening your heart even when you might get hurt, that is what makes life worth living. You taught me that, Preston. You and our children and the life we have built together." Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "I knew you were worth waiting for," he said softly, repeating the words he had spoken all those years ago. "Every moment of doubt, every day of uncertainty, it was all worth it to get here, to have this life with you. And I knew, even when I was too scared to say yes, that you were the kind of man worth taking a chance on," Winona replied. "The kind of man who would wait for months without complaint, who would show up day after day, even when I gave you nothing but uncertainty." The kind of man who keeps his promises, who stands by the people he loves, who builds a life with patient determination rather than demanding immediate gratification. They stood there in the garden as the summer evening deepened around them. Two people who had learned that love was not always easy or simple, but that it was always, always worth the effort. They had faced loss and hardship, celebrated victories and milestones, raised children and buried parents, and through it all, their love had remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Preston and Winona walked hand in hand back to the house where their family waited. Through the windows, they could see Patrick helping young Samuel with his schoolwork at the kitchen table, Grace showing Martha a new painting she had finished, the warm glow of lamplight making the scene look like something from a storybook. "This is what I was waiting for," Preston said quietly. "Not just you saying yes, but all of this. The life we have built, the family we have created, the love that has grown deeper and richer with every passing year. And it all started with you being willing to wait," Winona said, squeezing his hand. "Most men would have given up. But you believed in us even when I could not believe in myself. You gave me the space and time I needed to heal and grow brave enough to take the leap." "I would do it again," Preston said simply. "Every time I would choose to wait for you." They went inside together, into the warmth and light and love of the home they had made. And as the door closed behind them, the last rays of sunlight faded from the mountains, making way for the stars that would guide them through another night and into another day of the life they had chosen together. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. Patrick married his sweetheart in 1902 and brought her to live on the ranch, building a small house nearby where they started their own family. Preston and Winona became grandparents for the first time in 1903, when Patrick and his wife welcomed a daughter. Winona cried with joy when she held her granddaughter for the first time, marveling at how life continued to unfold in unexpected and beautiful ways. Grace eventually moved to Denver to pursue her art more seriously, but she came home often, bringing with her stories of the wider world and gifts for her younger brother. She never married, preferring her independence and her art, and Preston and Winona supported her choices even when some in town thought it scandalous for a woman to remain unmarried and pursue a career. Young Samuel proved to have a talent for working with horses, and by the time he was in his 20s, he had developed a reputation throughout Colorado for his ability to train even the most difficult animals. He was gentle and patient, qualities he had learned from watching his parents navigate their own relationship over the years. In 1910, Preston and Winona celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. By then, they were in their 50s, their bodies showing the wear of decades of ranch work, but their love for each other had never wavered. They had weathered everything life had thrown at them: financial hardships, family losses, the changing world around them, and they had done it together. One afternoon that summer, Winona found Preston repairing a fence in one of the far pastures. She had ridden out to bring him lunch, and they sat together in the shade of a cottonwood tree, eating bread and cheese and watching the cattle graze peacefully. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. "Saying yes to me, there were probably easier paths you could have chosen." Winona looked at him in surprise, then shook her head firmly. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Even on the hardest days, when money was tight, or we were arguing about something, or I was worried about the children, even then, I never regretted choosing you. You were right all those years ago when you said I was worth waiting for. But you were worth waiting for too, Preston. Worth every moment of fear I had to overcome to say yes." "I am glad you finally did," Preston said with a smile. "Say yes, I mean. I think by the end of that summer I was starting to lose hope. But you kept waiting anyway, Winona pointed out. That is the thing I have never forgotten. You did not try to pressure me or manipulate me or make me feel guilty for needing time. You just quietly, patiently waited, showing up day after day, proving through your actions that you were exactly the kind of man I could trust with my heart. They finished their lunch in comfortable silence. Then Preston returned to his work while Winona rode back to the house. As she looked back at her husband working in the summer sun, Winona felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. That frightened young woman who had been too scared to say yes all those years ago seemed like a stranger now. Life and love had transformed her into someone braver, stronger, more capable of facing whatever came. In 1915, Thomas Anders married late in life to a widow with 2 grown children. Preston was happy for his brother, who had waited even longer than Preston had for love. The 2 brothers remained close, running the ranch together as partners, and their families celebrated holidays and milestones together in the house that Martha Anders had once presided over. By 1920, Preston and Winona were in their 60s, with a sprawling family that included children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews. The ranch had grown considerably over the years, and Preston had begun teaching Patrick and Samuel how to manage it so that he could eventually step back from the daily operations. One evening that summer, almost 40 years after that long wait for her answer, Preston and Winona took a walk together along the creek where he had found her all those years ago, struggling with her decision. The cottonwood trees had grown taller, and the creek bed had shifted slightly with time and weather, but the essential character of the place remained the same. You remember standing here, telling me you needed more time? Preston asked, stopping at the spot where they had had that difficult conversation. I remember every moment of that summer, Winona said. Every conversation, every doubt, every fear. I remember sitting on that rock over there trying to work up the courage to say yes. I remember watching you ride away, your shoulders slumped with disappointment and wanting to call you back but being too afraid. What changed? Preston asked. What finally made you ready to say yes? Winona thought for a moment, then said, It was watching you help after my father's accident. Seeing you show up day after day, working yourself to exhaustion for my family without expecting anything in return. I realized that you were not going to leave just because things got hard. And if you could be that committed to us before we were even married, I knew I could trust you to keep that commitment afterward. I almost gave up, Preston confessed. Near the end, I almost decided that you were never going to say yes and I should move on. But something kept me coming back, kept me hoping. I am glad you did, Winona said, taking his hand. I am glad you were stubborn enough to wait for me to find my courage. Because this life we have built our children, our grandchildren, this ranch, these 40 years together, it has been more than I ever dreamed possible. You were right that day when you said I was worth waiting for, but so were you. We were both worth the wait. They walked slowly back to the house as the sun set, moving more carefully than they once had, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work and hard living. But their hands were clasped together, and their love was as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger for having weathered so many years and so many challenges. Inside the house, several of their grandchildren were visiting, filling the rooms with noise and laughter. Patrick's oldest daughter was teaching Samuel's youngest son how to play checkers. Grace had come home for a visit and was showing the children her latest paintings. The house that had once seemed so quiet and empty now overflowed with life and love. Preston pulled Winona aside for a moment, away from the chaos, and kissed her gently. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" she asked, though she was smiling because she knew. For saying yes, he replied. For taking that leap of faith all those years ago, for building this life with me. For being exactly who you are. Thank you for waiting, Winona said, touching his weathered face with tender fingers. For being patient enough to give me the time I needed. For proving that you were worth the risk. For showing me that love is not about avoiding pain, but about finding someone worth facing the pain with. They rejoined their family, settling into their favorite chairs while the grandchildren played around them. Preston reached for Winona's hand, and she gave it readily, their fingers intertwining in the way they had done thousands of times over the decades. As the evening deepened and the children were eventually rounded up and taken home by their parents, Preston and Winona found themselves alone again in the quiet house. They prepared for bed in the comfortable routine of a long marriage, moving around each other with practiced ease. Lying in bed that night, Preston pulled Winona close and she nestled against his shoulder in the way she had done for 40 years. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love you too," she replied. "Always have, even when I was too scared to admit it. Always will, until my last breath." They fell asleep that way. Two people who had chosen each other across a summer of waiting and doubt, who had built a life together on the foundation of that choice, who had proven day after day, year after year, that love was worth whatever it cost. The final years of their lives were gentle ones. Preston eventually retired fully from ranch work, turning over the operations to Patrick and Samuel. He and Winona spent their days in quieter pursuits, sitting on the porch watching the mountains, reading together in the evenings, taking slow walks around the property they had nurtured for so many years. Their children and grandchildren visited often, and the house was rarely quiet. Preston particularly enjoyed teaching his grandchildren to ride and rope, passing on the skills he had learned from his own father. Winona delighted in baking with her granddaughters, teaching them her recipes and telling them stories about the old days. In the summer of 1925, exactly 43 years after that long wait for her answer, Preston and Winona celebrated their anniversary with a party attended by their entire extended family. There were nearly 30 people gathered at the ranch that day, children, grandchildren, even a few great-grandchildren. As Preston looked around at all the faces, all the lives that had sprung from his and Winona's union, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. During the party, Patrick stood up to make a toast. He was now in his 40s, a capable man who ran the ranch with quiet competence. "I want to say something about my parents," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I have spent my whole life watching them love each other, and it has taught me what a marriage should be. They have shown me that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every single day, that it requires patience, forgiveness, humor, and above all, commitment. Ma, Pa, thank you for showing us what it looks like to build a life with someone, to weather storms together, to choose each other again and again over the decades. You are the foundation of this family, and we are all better people for having you as examples." Preston felt tears prick his eyes as his son spoke, and when he looked over at Winona, he saw she was crying openly. Their family applauded, and then everyone wanted to hear the story again, the story of how Preston had waited all summer for Winona's answer, how she had finally said yes, how he had told her she was worth waiting for. They told the story together, finishing each other's sentences the way couples who have been together for decades often do. They spoke about the fear and doubt, the patience and hope, the moment when Winona finally found the courage to say yes. Their grandchildren listened with rapt attention, the older ones who had heard it before still finding new meaning in it, the younger ones hearing it for the first time. "The lesson," Preston said at the end, is that good things are worth waiting for. And that love, real love, is worth any amount of uncertainty or fear. Your grandmother was terrified, but she found the courage to say yes anyway. And that single yes changed both of our lives forever. The lesson, Winona added, is that sometimes we need time to heal and grow before we can fully open our hearts, and that if someone truly loves us, they will give us that time. Your grandfather's patience was one of the greatest gifts anyone has ever given me. As the party wound down and family members began to depart, Preston and Winona stood on the porch waving goodbye, arms around each other's waists. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, they turned to each other and smiled. 43 years, Winona said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into this, Preston said, gesturing around at the ranch, the house, the life they had built. Into our children and grandchildren. Into every morning we woke up together and every evening we fell asleep in each other's arms. The time did not disappear, it just transformed into something else. Something beautiful. Preston lived to see his 72nd birthday, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the early spring of 1927. Winona held his hand as he took his last breath, tears streaming down her face but grateful that they had been given so many years together. She lived for 3 more years, spending them surrounded by her children and grandchildren, always with a portrait of Preston nearby. She would sit on the porch in good weather, looking out at the mountains, and sometimes visitors would find her talking softly to herself, or rather, to Preston, sharing with him the news of their family, the small happenings of daily life. When Winona died in the summer of 1930, exactly 48 years after that long summer of waiting, her family gathered to mourn her passing but also to celebrate the remarkable life she had lived. At her funeral, Patrick spoke again about his parents' love story, about the summer of waiting and the decades of devotion that followed. My mother was afraid, he said, but she did not let fear win. She found the courage to say yes to love, and because she did, all of us exist. This family, this ranch, this legacy, it all started with a question asked in hope and answered in courage. My father waited, and my mother said yes, and together they built something that will endure long after we are all gone. Preston and Winona were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could forever watch over the land and the family they had created together. Their gravestone bore a simple inscription that their children chose. He waited. She said yes. Together, they built a life worth living. In the years that followed, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to gather at the ranch for holidays and celebrations. The story of that summer of waiting became family legend, passed down through generations as an example of what true love looked like: patient, persistent, willing to wait for the right moment, brave enough to say yes despite fear. The ranch continued to thrive under the care of Preston and Winona's descendants, each generation adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation laid by their ancestors. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the sun was setting over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, those who knew the story would pause in their work and remember the cowboy who waited all summer for an answer, the woman who finally found the courage to say yes, and the enduring love that proved, without a doubt, that some things are worth waiting for. Their love story became woven into the fabric of La Veta, Colorado, a testament to the power of patience, the courage required to open one's heart, and the beautiful things that can grow when two people choose each other against all odds. It reminded everyone who heard it that love is not always easy or simple, that sometimes it requires wading through uncertainty and choosing to trust even when fear whispers that it is safer to hold back. But most importantly, Preston and Winona's story showed that, When you find the right person, someone worth waiting for, someone worth taking risks for the wait, and the risk transform into something precious beyond measure. They showed that a single yes, given after careful thought and hard-won courage, can be the beginning of a legacy that extends far beyond two individual lives. And so their story lived on, generation after generation, a reminder that true love is patient, that courage can conquer fear, and that sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for, no matter how long the summer stretches on, no matter how uncertain the outcome seems, no matter how afraid we might be. Preston had known Winona was worth waiting for, and history proved him right in ways neither of them could have imagined that day she finally said yes. Their descendants carried forward the lessons learned from that summer of 1882, lessons about patience and courage, about the importance of giving people space to heal and grow, about the power of showing up day after day even when the outcome is uncertain. The ranch continued to stand as a monument to their love, and the family they created together continued to flourish, branches spreading wide from the strong trunk they had established through decades of devotion and partnership. Preston and Winona's story, born from a summer of waiting and sealed with a courageous yes, became exactly what they had both hoped for during those uncertain months, a love story for the ages, proof that good things come to those who wait, and that sometimes the greatest acts of love are found not in grand gestures but in the quiet, patient persistence of someone who believes in you even when you struggle to believe in yourself.